Paddington in the Garden, written by Michael Bond. One morning, Paddington went out into the garden and began making a list of all the nice things he could think of about being a bear and living with the Browns. He had a room of his own and a warm bed to sleep in, and he had marmalade for breakfast every morning. In darkest Peru, he had only been allowed it on Sundays. The list was soon so long he had nearly run out of paper before he realised he had left out one of the nicest things of all. Oh, what do you think it's going to be? Think about our title. The garden itself. Apart from the occasional noise from a nearby building site, it was so quiet and peaceful, it didn't seem like being in London at all. But nice gardens don't just happen. They usually require a lot of hard work. And the one at number 22, Windsor Gardens, was no exception. Mr. Brown had to mow the lawn twice a week, and Mrs. Brown was kept busy weeding the flower bed. There was always something to do. Even Mrs. Bird lent a hand whenever she had a spare moment. It was Mrs. Brown who first suggested giving Jonathan, Judy and Paddington each a piece of the garden. "It will keep certain bears out of mischief," she said meaningfully, "and it will be fun for Jonathan and Judy as well." Mr. Brown agreed it was a very good idea indeed, and he marked out 3 plots at the far end of the lawn. Paddington was most excited. "I don't suppose there are many bears who have their own garden," he exclaimed. Early the next morning, all 3 set to work. Judy decided to make a flower bed, and Jonathan had his eye on some old paving slabs. Paddington didn't know what to do. In the past, he had often found that gardening was much harder than it looked, especially when you only had paws. In the end, armed with a jar of Mrs. Brown's homemade marmalade, he borrowed Mr. Brown's wheelbarrow and set off to look for ideas. His first stop was a stall in the market, where he bought a book called How to Plan Your Garden by Lionel Trugg. It was complete with a large packet of assorted seeds, and if the picture on the front cover was anything to go by, it was no wonder Mr. Trugg looked happy. He seemed to be doing most of the planning while lying on a hammock. By the end of the book, without lifting a finger, he was surrounded by blooms. Paddington decided it was a very good value indeed, especially when the owner of the stall gave him 2p change. Mr. Trugg's book was full of useful hints and tips. The first one suggested that before starting work, it was a good idea to close your eyes and try to picture what the garden would look like when it was finished. Having walked into the lamppost by mistake, Paddington decided to read another page or 2, and there he found a much better idea. Mr. Trugg advised standing back and looking at the site from a safe distance, preferably somewhere high up. Paddington knew just the spot. Oh, where do you think he's going to stand, I wonder? By the time Paddington reached the building site near Mrs. Brown's house, it was the middle of the morning, and the men were all at their tea break. Placing his jar of marmalade on a wooden platform for safekeeping, he sat on a pile of bricks for a rest while he considered the matter. There was nobody about, and there was no ladder nearby. How was he going to see his garden? Trugg was quite right. The Browns' garden did look very different from high up. But before he had time to get his breath back, Paddington heard the sound of an engine starting up. He peered through a gap in the boards. As he did so, his eyes nearly popped out. On the garden just below him, a man was emptying a load of concrete on the very spot where he had left his jar of marmalade. Paddington scrambled back down the ladder as fast as his legs could carry him, reaching the bottom just as the foreman came around a corner. "Is anything wrong?" asked the man. "You look very upset." "My jar's been buried!" exclaimed Paddington hotly, pointing to the pile of concrete. It had some of Mrs. Bird's best golden chunks in it. "I won't ask how your jar got there," said the foreman, turning to Paddington as his men set to work clearing the concrete into small piles, "or what you were doing up the ladder." "I'm glad of that," said Paddington, politely raising his hat. Suddenly, there was a whirring sound from somewhere overhead, and to Paddington's surprise, the platform landed at his feet. "My marmalade!" he exclaimed thankfully. "Your marmalade?" repeated the foreman, staring at the jar. "Did you say marmalade?" "That's right," said Paddington. "I put it there ready for my 11s. It must have been taken up by mistake. Now the top's come off." Uh-oh. It was the foreman's turn to look as though he couldn't believe his eyes. "That special quick-drying cement," he wailed. "It's probably rock hard already, ruined by a bear's marmalade. No one will give me a twopence for it now." "I will," said Paddington eagerly. "I have got an idea." Can you predict what Paddington's idea is going to be? I think I can. Paddington was busy for the rest of the week. When the builders saw the rock garden he had made, they were most impressed, and the foreman even gave him some plants to finish it off until his seeds started to grow. "It's National Garden Day on Saturday," he said. "There are some very famous people judging it. I'll spread the word around. You never know your luck." There's Paddington's garden. The foreman was as good as his word, and on Saturday half the neighbourhood turned up at number 22 Windsor Gardens to see the judges arrive. Paddington nearly fell over backwards with surprise when he discovered that no less a person than Mr. Lionel Trugg himself was leading the procession. "It's very good of you to get out of your hammock, Mr. Trugg," he exclaimed. "Not at all," replied Lionel Trugg. "My pleasure, I must say. I love your orange stones. Where did you find them?" "I didn't," said Paddington. "I think they found me, thanks to my builders." "Congratulations," said Mr. Trugg as he handed Paddington a gold star. "It's good to see a young bear taking up gardening. I hope you'll be the first of many." "Who would have believed it?" said Mr. Brown as the last of the crowd departed. "You must write and tell Aunt Lucy all about it," said Mrs. Bird. "They'll be very excited in the Home for Retirement Bears when they hear your news." Paddington thought that was a very good idea, but he had something to do first. What do you think Paddington's going to do before he writes his letter? He wanted to add one more important item to his list of all the nice things that there were about being a bear and living with the Browns. "Having my own rock garden," he wrote. Then he signed his name and added his paw print, just to show that it was genuine. And that's the story of Paddington Bear. It would be lovely if you could write a list of all the things that you're thankful for. Thank you for listening. Bye.